Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Born to Rule, the making and remaking of the British elite is a uniquely data-rich analysis of the British elite from the Victorian era to today. Who gets in, how they get there, what they like and what they look like, where they go to school, what politics they perpetuate. It's a fascinating new book by Aaron Reeves and Sam Friedman. I'd like to say that Aaron Reeves joins me live on the line today, probably from a courtyard somewhere near Eton, I'd imagine. Aaron, good morning to you.
Yeah, slightly less fancy than that, but yeah, it's great to talk to you this morning.
Good to have you with us. We have this idea, don't we, of the elites? If they all go to Eton, they then go to Oxford and Cambridge, and then they segue seemingly into the corridors of wealth, power, and influence. And I mean, I suppose up to a certain point, perhaps the Second World War, that's pretty much true.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that there was a period in time, particularly in the kind of caricatures of the British elite, where we just assumed there was this gilded passage between going to Eton, going to Oxford, and then getting into power, often with the help of family. And I think there's an idea that changed a great deal post-Second World War. And there is some truth to that story. It hasn't been a smooth trajectory. But the truth is, it hasn't changed as much as we might think.
Now, you're a professor of sociology at London School of Economics, correct? Right. So presumably you have an in-depth knowledge of this thing, but rather than just make sort of broad sweeps of the brush and go, well, that's how it is. You've quote unquote, to use modern parlance, done the research, quote unquote, and done some data crunching, which must be very, very, must have been revealing it in itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. We spent a lot of time trying to collect as much data as we could among people that are in the British elite. So today that's about 33,000 people, at least by our definition. But over time, we tracked this, as you said, back to the end of the Victorian era, looking at 125,000 people. So there's a huge amount of data that underpins this. And it's taken 7 years to try and collect all of this material, which we've distilled down into this single book.
And whereabouts did you actually get this material from? Is it school records? Is it and then is it sort of, I don't know, people who go into the House of Commons? Is it people going into the House of Lords? Is it captains of industry? What's if you like the modus operandi, and what qualifies you as the elite?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very contentious question that actually, people can debate and disagree about. What we did is we focused on a particular book in the UK called Who's Who, and that's been published in its current form since about 1897. And actually, they do have information about schools, universities, the jobs that people have had. But what we did, which I think is a bit original, is to try and supplement that with information about the parents of the people in Who's Who. So we know something about whether they were born into wealth or not. We know something about whether their siblings or partners were in the book too. And we also did surveys and interviews with people that are currently in Who's Who, and actually got access to archival interviews with some of these people that have since passed away but were included in the book decades ago.
It must be really interesting to look at the sort of the 1890s Who's Who, because if you think about it, I mean, because I was just saying, well, they went to Oxford and Cambridge and Eton and that whole thing, and then they come in and it doesn't change to the First War. But if I just think to the Second War, you could say to the First War, that's another conversation. But if you think about it, 1890s, so we've had the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of new industrialists, these, the Docks, Tannic Mills crowd, will have made their money, but they will, of course, they will be viewed by the old money as the new money. So that's quite interesting to see where they must have come from.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's always been churn in terms of who gets to these positions of power. I think it's never been true that it's been an entirely closed shop. And I think in some ways that caricature has been a disservice to us because it's overemphasized, I think, the degree of elite reproduction. And it's always been true that there's been contestation, even within the elite, again, who gets to count. And those old industrialists that you mentioned, they come in and actually they bought up many of the landed estates. They purchased the kind of art collections of some of those people that had lost their fortunes because of collapsing agricultural prices. So there's always been that kind of movement. And the story that we want to tell, I think, is that, yes, the kind of old aristocracy doesn't exist in the same way that it once did, but being born into wealth still gives you the same kinds of advantages in terms of getting into these top positions that it almost always has. And that's, I think, a really surprising story for many people who think that, as you say, that actually, British society is really different. The people that run the top businesses today, they come from different backgrounds than they once did. And our story is that maybe that's not as true as we might think.
The how much of a culture shock then? But was the Second World War? Because I'm just thinking about all those great country houses. I mean, everybody likes to look back at like Downton Abbey and I think, oh, it was wonderful, but everybody knew their place and the whole thing. But the harsh reality is that, but by this point in the 20s and heading into the Depression of the 30s, these places were bust basically, and they couldn't afford. So that's why Brideshead, which is one that people go, oh, Brideshead was great, but the opening of Brideshead is, of course, he goes and he finds himself in the old house that he used to run around in. So the world sort of changed on its axis, and there was a certain, because most of the officer class, especially in the infantry, were killed off during the Second World War. There was more of building a land fit for heroes, and therefore, Churchill goes straight after the war in terms of the next election, and we get the Labour government and the NHS. How much did that turn things on its head, or did the elites? I'll let you answer in a second. Did the elites sort of close ranks, as it were?
I think that's right. I think we wouldn't want to say that nothing changed, because of course it did. And actually the basis of power in British society shifted a great deal. It moved from those landed estates that you mentioned up to kind of more industrial power, and even to some extent power through the state, because one of the things that Labour government did in the post-Second World War was massively expand the activities of the state. The civil service expanded. That kind of state-led power became much more important. And at the same time, the cultural basis of the elite really shifted. And I think this is one of the really important things, because in the past, the elite lauded their privilege, but today they want to come across as being ordinary and everyday. They don't want to be seen as different from everyone else and special. Now they just want to be like everyone else. I
was in London during the when Lock, Stock came out, the great Mockney explosion of the 90s, and you had people who were pretending, who were landed and were pretending to be from the East End. We talk a dark day for everybody. We talk about influence and elite, but of course, the old heavy industries, or the way it used to perpetuate, have gone. And now we have a playing field that is changing so rapidly that when we talk about elite, is that influence? And if it is influence, surely that is now being manifested in so many different ways that it's not just having a factory or backing a political power. It's how you are getting your message out there to your followers.
I think that's exactly right. I think we don't want to say that power hasn't changed, or the nature of power hasn't changed. There are some things that have been pretty steady, right? Like the power of government has been pretty consistent over that period. The size of some aspects of government have risen and fallen. But we can, I think, without really that much imagination, think of areas of the elite that have declined in significance, right? Like the religious leaders used to be incredibly important, but now much less so. The military, again, used to be incredibly important, but much less so. And particular kinds of industries have risen and fallen with the changing basis of the economy. And you're right, like the kind of new forms of influence and power that play out are definitely different than they once were. And what Who's Who is really trying to do in some ways is actually capture some of those changes.
But here's the thing, and here's the particularly English thing about this. Okay, so you can come from a working class background, say, and you invent the widget, the super widget, the widget that puts all other widgets into a cocked hat. Okay, and so you become incredibly rich and you have your power and the whole thing, and then you have children because you are rich and you can afford to have children. But what have you found this? What perpetuates is the fact that what you then do is, even though you may have come from the streets of wherever, you get to this certain level and you go, well, I was born to this and I want to hang out with these people. I want my children to go to the school that their children go to. So they unwittingly become part of the elite, and you are doing exactly the thing that you are programmed to do. And you are now part of the thing that you came from, you had nothing to do with.
Absolutely. I think that's right. Like, people very understandably want to try and give their kids the best chance in life that they can. And if they've kind of made good and had like huge amounts of money now, many of them will invest in the same kinds of elite schools and elite universities that the kind of preceding elite would have done too. And actually what's, I think, fascinating about that is it's exactly that process that we see playing out pretty consistently. So if you were born into the top 1% of the wealth distribution at the end of the 19th century, you're as likely to get into the elite as you are among the current crop of people that run Britain today. And I think that makes sense because of exactly those mechanisms that you're pointing towards. What's really interesting is that today, if you're like a second generation elite, what you'll often do is draw upon your parents' experience of growing up poor to try and downplay any advantages that you had in your life. You'll try to obfuscate the privilege that you've had in your life often. And that's one thing we see very commonly among our elites.
How, and this, here comes a curveball. How difficult it is for those who are second or third generation of immigrant parents, I'm thinking West Indians or those from the former colony, to crack an elite, or because we hear about, I mean, it used to be the situation, I'm being really careful how I phrase this, so bear with me, Aaron. It used to be saying that the only people of colour that you would see at an Eton would be an African prince, or sector, or a Rajah's son. And if I've offended anybody, I don't mean to, but this is what I'm saying. How difficult it is for those particular groups to break into elites, or do they even care about it?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely been some change in terms of the kind of racial, ethnic composition of the British elite. But actually, I think much less than you might imagine. I mean, in British society, we've just had very recently politicians, one of the most ethnically diverse cabinets in British history. But actually, when you look at the elite beyond politics, there's actually been much less change. And so, yes, those schools that you mentioned have diversified. So if you go to Oxford, where I used to work just recently, or you go to Eton, they've got a very international intake in terms of their student body. But the people that are getting into the elite in Britain at least, haven't changed all that much.
But you say that, we had the most diverse cabinet, the whole thing. Yes, at face value. But then if you look at the policies and the values that those second or third generation had, they are elite. They're not, it's not saying I come from this background and I used to do this. They are perpetuating the elite mindset because that's the way they've been taught.
I think that's right. One thing we see is the kind of big ideological variation within the elite. There are some people who espouse what we might think of conservative political ideologies, but there are also people on the kind of maybe more progressive left end of the spectrum. And where you come from does make a difference to the kind of ideological position that you have. And there's a great deal of people, as you say, I mean, that particular government, ethnically diverse, but politically very conservative and pursuing a particular agenda that may actually be kind of anti-immigrant in many respects, which is kind of paradoxical. But that background does have some lingering influence in a variety of different dimensions, particularly around class and gender. Is there
an alternative elite? I mean, I know Cummings famously said, we are metropolitan elites in the media. I know I'm a member of the mainstream media, apparently. So therefore, is there a new elite? Is it the metropolitan elite? Is that a thing?
Our argument would be that there are new elites because there are new sectors which come to dominate in a particular, like tech has become incredibly important. And maybe even media has risen in prominence in some ways. But I don't think the newness, I think, is perhaps less important than some of the continuities that we see. So as I said, coming from elite backgrounds. So there's a story in Britain at the moment that there's this new kind of, inverted commas, woke elite who are driving a particular cultural agenda. And, there might be some truth to kind of the rising argument that actually there's been a shift in terms of some of the values, but actually that remains a minority of the elite in general. The people that have power, the people that have extreme wealth still exist, and their political views continue to be on the ideological right, overwhelmingly so.
Now, the blurb I've got said, who they are, where they came from, where they went to school, what politics they perpetuate, fair enough, and what they want. So presumably, not to upstate the status quo, I would imagine, is what the majority of the elites want, no?
That's exactly what we find. I mean, we actually I mentioned before, we did some surveys with the elite. We actually also ran some kind of quite clever experiments with them where we tried to test their preference for the status quo.
Right.
And actually, overwhelmingly, much like everyone else, I mean, in this respect, the elites aren't that different, but they definitely favour the status quo. They want things to remain the same. But what's really interesting here is that when the status quo benefits their self-interest, they're much more likely to favour that over policies which might benefit other groups in society, particularly those at the bottom in the income distribution.
Did you find your perception when you went in to do this study? And I know that you're London School of Economics, so you don't have this. Did you find your perception when you actually get to sit and talk to these people had changed something? Did you find a sympathy? Did it change something for yourselves on how you deal with them? The elite did the elite have problems too, quote unquote?
Of course. I mean, when you spend any time with people and you want to try and get and understand their lives and their worlds, you develop a sense of who they are as people and try to understand their perspective on the world. And obviously, my own experience is slightly different from many of the people that we interviewed and spoke with, and it's fascinating to spend time with them. And what I think is really difficult sometimes to get your head around is the sense of their own lack of power. So when you talk to them, they will often, reject any idea that they're powerful, that they're elite themselves, that they have any kind of real influence. But when you talk to them, actually hear their experience about the things they've been able to do in their lives, between the lines, you can see that actually, compared to most of us, these individuals really do have influence over British society.
What are you hoping that people will learn about this then? Is it to understand the elite rather than just a caricature, to see where the real power lies?
I think that's right. We want to cut through many of the caricatures that exist about the elite, and that comes from a variety of different directions. I think some see it as the kind of metropolitan elite you've described. There's another kind of elite that's sort of, the capitist elite that are just dominating everything in society. We want to try and cut through some of these stereotypes with the data that we have and actually just foster a debate about whether the elites that we have are really the kind that we want, and whether there's anything that we can do in society to potentially remake those in order to reflect more faithfully the things that we want for our community and society.
How would we make those changes? I'm not saying sort of storm the put up barricades and storm the House, the House of Westminster. But what changes could we make?
Yeah, I think for us, one of the things that comes through is that we should need to do more to disrupt the pathways and trajectories that have smoothed the paths for many people into elite positions. So, as you said, that kind of channel that moves through elite schooling, through elite universities into these positions of power. We think that we should try and disrupt those institutions somewhat in order to either break the relationships between those institutions or diversify the intake of particular institutions. So be more concrete. What would we do? We would basically remake the admissions process at universities like Oxford and Cambridge. We would say you can't recruit more than 10% of your intake from private schools because that's the proportion of A-level students in the country that go to a private school. And our vision there is that actually that would change radically the kinds of people that get into those elite institutions. At the same time, we'd also implement a wealth tax to try and break the link between wealth and elite reproduction. And there's other ideas that we have too. But I think the point here is to try and remake both how people get into the elite, but also who gets to use power within British society.
Fascinating stuff. The book is called Born to Rule, The Making and Remaking of the British Elite. It is by Sam Freeman and Aaron Reeves, who are speaking today. Aaron, if people want to find you online, presumably you are relatively easy to discover on the internet. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so my website is aaronreeves.org, and I'm on Twitter at Aaron S. Reeves.
Marvellous. And you can also order the book via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Born to Rule. Aaron, it's been a fascinating and eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.